It's kind of crazy that just after after a couple of days of not being here, I would fall back on this kind of problems. All right, now all the things that have happened since I was here. I was in San Diego for several days teaching what I do. And oh my goodness, it was nice to get out of town. It was nice to be in San Diego. It was nice to be able to talk to well over 100 doctors. And I just had a great rest, a great getaway, and look at all the stuff that's happened in between. So what I want to talk about today is, of course, catch up on the news and this Epstein class horror show that is continuing on. If you take a step back from the rush of all these events that have happened the last few days, and the fact that the old order is just collapsing is dramatically evident. The Western casino economic system is cracking up with debt, with crypto, with non-production. The Western military system, whether global NATO or unilateral US or European Union, is exposed to be dead in the head. The Western political cultural system in this Epstein class horror show that I was talking about. Emblematic is this week's trip by the British King and Queen to the United States during the 250th anniversary of our country, defeating those people. And the spectacle, is ongoing. Flags, red carpet on the tarmac at Andrews, followed by a tea party in town. Well, I think, as the LaRouche organization said, the British are back to finish the War of 1812. The extreme danger is this change of direction does not come about. It's seen in the insanity, the absolute insanity of certain European nations squaring off against Russia, a nuclear power. And the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, issued a statement about a week ago about the military strategy of Germany and their armed forces, stressing that Russia poses an acute threat to Germany. And so this massive mobilization for rearmament is necessary. He proclaimed, he says, we're developing the Bundeswehr into a strategically critical conventional army for Europe. Moreover, the German foreign minister, who will attend this week's 11th International Review of the Treaty of Nuclear Non-Proliferation, spoke again how the nuclear arms capability remains under consideration for Germany as a deterrence to the Russian attack. And then the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warned of these blatant European moves and statements in his April 24th speech in Moscow to a meeting of the NGOs. He said this: a war against us has been openly declared. In order to justify their policy, the West, above all the international bureaucracy in Brussels, as well as Berlin, Paris, and of course London, are attempting to demonize everything Russian and openly speak about gearing up for war with us in the foreseeable future. Chief of Defense of the Belgian Armed Forces said that they will have several years to go and Ukraine is just buying time for them. Just craziness, just absolute craziness that's going on. Now, I want to get to Charles III and Queen Camilla and what's going on in Washington. I want to get to this so-called assassination attempt against the president that some people are calling or claiming it's nothing more than just a final bid to be able to build the White House ballroom so that they can have security. Just this comedy show continues. But I want to talk about the Russian President Putin and Foreign Minister Agrachi meeting in St. Petersburg, because this is significant. Agrachi had landed in St. Petersburg early yesterday morning after meetings in Oman and a brief stopover in Islamabad. And on the Iranians, well, after welcome, I don't need to go into who was there, because who's who important was there. And after welcoming Agrachi, Putin reported that last week he had received a message from Iran's supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. Putin said, "I'd like to ask you to convey my most sincere gratitude for this, and to reaffirm that Russia, just like Iran, tends to continue fostering our strategic relations." Putin promised that Russia is going to do everything that serves Iran's interests. Agrachi said, "We're here to reaffirm that. And for us, Iranian-Russian relations represent a strategic partnership of the highest level." And it's just so odd that Russia gets blamed for sharing their intelligence and their strategic positioning with GPS through their satellites to know where to attack American bases and where to attack strategic positions inside of Israel, when that's exactly what we are doing with the Ukrainians, using our intelligence, our GPS, our satellite surveillance to know where to attack the Russians. Now, it's just so silly. But this new German strategy of preparing for war against Russia, I think Pistorius said something about wanting to be ready by 2029, with or without the Americans. Well, I want to say something about King Charles. Did you know that King Charles suggested that we rip up the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and join the British Commonwealth? He actually suggested that. Wouldn't you like to be a part of the Commonwealth, to be a part of Canada and Australia, New Zealand, several other countries that are part, several African countries? And so we could be part of the Commonwealth and bow down to the king in recognition of that. I think if President Donald Trump and the U.S. Congress agree to do this, I think they will have delivered a resounding answer to Ben Franklin's challenge. We gave you a republic if you can keep it. And so joining the Commonwealth, we will hereby throw away our republic. Now, who invited the British royals to address a joint session of the U.S. Congress on the 250th anniversary of the American Declaration of Independence? Who asked these people to come over here? I mean, formally speaking, the invitation was, appropriately enough, on April Fool's Day, 2026, and was issued by no less by the following fools: Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, Senate Leader Thune, Senate Minority Leader Schumer, and House Minority Leader Jeffries. But as we've seen on too many occasions, it doesn't seem to be members of Congress calling the shots anymore, but rather they're big money Epstein class owners. So in 1776, it was the subject of the American Declaration of Independence, which includes a long list of grievances, crimes actually, committed by the British against the American colonists. The British never apologized for these abuses, but went on to attempt to burn down Washington in 1812, and to promote the slave trade, and to promote the Confederacy during the misnamed Civil War. And after the United States became an independent republic, the British were also involved in the assassinations of American presidents, as was well documented in the book written by Anton Chaikin, Why the British Kill American Presidents. And while the British have never offered reparations for their crimes, I think it is to be noted that Queen Elizabeth II, on the 100th anniversary of Lyndon LaRouche's birth, who points these things out clearly, died and left this planet on her way to her eternal reward on September 8th, 2022, thus bringing her son Charles to the throne. Now, over the centuries, the British Empire, the monarchy, has presided over the genocide through starvation of 80 million people in India, over 1 million people in Ireland, entire nations on the continent of Africa. The British also ran the Opium Wars against China, and together with the French, made the arbitrary borders in Southwest Asia, which today, of course, is helping to keep that region in a state of perpetual war, which was its intent. Charles' younger brother Andrew has now been thoroughly disgraced for his intimate involvement with the notorious pedophile, intelligence operative, and financier Jeffrey Epstein. But we need to remember that it was Charles's own 20-year relationship with the disgusting Jimmy Savile, accused of sexual abuse by over 450 people. London's Guardian reported April 6 back in 2022, quote, "The makers of the Netflix documentary Jimmy Savile, A British Horror Story, revealed that Savile produced a PR handbook for royals and their staff. Some of that advice was then incorporated in a note prepared for the Queen. It is likely, in fact it is even possible, that His Satanic Majesty Charles had no knowledge or participation in the Hellfire Club, like activities of the Epstein cabal. Someone should ask the king whatever became of his deceased ex-wife, Diana." But somehow this sordid history makes Charles eligible to be invited to address a joint session of the United States Congress. And since the bar of excellence, the bar of who they would invite to speak before Congress, was shot to hell 2 years ago when the genocidal madman Bibi Netanyahu was greeted by over 50 standing ovations when he addressed the Congress. But for most Americans, most patriotic Americans, this idea is repulsive. And on top of this, apparently, King Tampon, as Charles is effectively known, has also proposed now, in what seems to be an honest attempt on his part, to disinvite the United States from its constitutional and declaration background to become part of the British Commonwealth. Well, Charles and Camilla should be disinvited from coming here and deported from the United States immediately. And rather than inviting perverts and war criminals to address the U.S. Congress, the Congress should now be convening an emergency session to halt funding for this Iran war. Following that, Congress should restore the honor of the United States by exonerating LaRouche, who warned of all of this, enacting his 4 laws, restarting the Glass-Steagall Act, and bankrupting the Epstein class, which we have the governmental authority to do. We just don't have the balls. Now, this world clearly is hanging by a silk thread. And whatever may be the background of the recent assassination attempt on Trump, in any case, does not speak for the stability of this world. Now, obviously, you all know what happened. There was this 31-year-old mechanical engineer who has no previous criminal record. And although he has gone regularly to a shooting range, and there is no criminality in that, he had a legally acquired weapon, no criminality in that. In any case, this guy is going to be brought before judges today, so we might find out something more. Now, if you listen to Larry Johnson, made a video yesterday, I was watching it this morning, pointing out a couple of very, very strange irregularities in this shooting. Except nothing was shot at the president. In fact, he didn't even get into the room where the president was located. He's now been charged with attempting to assassinate the president of the United States. He wasn't anywhere near him. But anyway, Johnson, I was listening to him this morning, said the fact that the shooter was able to barge through the security and then was just captured, not shot, although there were bullets flying all over the place. And as I was talking to Paul about this earlier, these are supposed to be the best sharpshooters on the planet. The Secret Service that protect the president should be able to drop a charging assailant at least 25, 30 feet with one shot. Everybody missed. Something wrong with that. But naturally, this, of course, is being celebrated by the media. How wonderful that they didn't quite immediately shoot him. However, what Larry Johnson points out is the fact that this is extremely strange because, given the fact that if some man is running, shooting around in the air, is running by that close to the security guards, and for their own self-protection, they would normally shoot such a person and put him down, didn't seem to be threatened themselves, then even more odd is the fact that there's video footage to back it up. Very, very strange is the fact that the Secret Service first evacuated J.D. Vance from the podium. And then only 15 to 30 seconds later, which under those circumstances is an enormously long time when bullets are flying, except they weren't flying in the room where they were located. Then they proceeded to guide Trump and Melania, and I think the second lady followed this group off the dais. This goes against all security protocols, at least as I understand them. So no matter how this is going to turn out to be, it's a very strange, ominous, so-called lone assassin once again. Now, he produced a manifesto where he said that he was going after the government, which he thinks should be held accountable, and he will no longer permit a pedophile, rapist, traitor, he said, to coat my hands with his crimes, excluding explicitly FBI Director Kash Patel as targets of the government prioritized from the highest ranking to the lowest. So whatever this turns out to be, there are naturally many, many suspicious stories circulating even from the MAGA ranks that this was all arranged by Trump himself, even all the way back to Butler with the first assassination attempt. Now, I'm not going to comment any further than that. We'll just have to see how this turns out. But obviously, this was with a very strange time coincidence. One day later is the arrival of King Charles and Queen Camilla, which, as I said, is on the occasion of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, which is a travesty all by itself, because why would you celebrate the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain when the American Revolution was done against these sons of bitches in the first place? So it's a clear attempt by the British to make the Americans and the rest of the world forget what the issue of the American Revolution was all about. Naturally, Trump, with his previous visit, enjoying a state banquet in Windsor Castle, had invited such idiocy to take place. And now it's reported that the relationship in the meantime has soured quite a bit because of the British refusal to join the United States and Israel in the war against Iran. But in any case, I think the visit will be overshadowed for sure by the Epstein scandal because of the king's brother, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, who was stripped of his royal titles, facing legal persecution over allegations of his relationship with Epstein. So we'll just have to see how this plays out. But naturally, I would like to hear what kind of music they're going to play at the state banquet, and who's sitting next to whom, and how things are arranged at the table. But I think the issue of the American Revolution is being brought back to the attention of the world so that the aim of this visit can backfire. Now, obviously, this is all taking place in the environment, as I started off talking, of the ongoing, pending continuation of the Iran war. So Agrachi, if you've been watching his travels, he returning, briefly to Islamabad, then visiting Oman for bilateral meetings, and is now in Moscow. And he's supposed to, or maybe has already met with Putin. Obviously, the whole issue of what's really at stake with the Iran war will be the issue of discussion. But now the Oman foreign minister was briefed by Agrachi, and they expressed mutual trust and constructive cooperation between the two countries. And Oman, sitting there at the bottom of the Gulf, and sitting there at the bottom of the Red Sea, which is an even more narrow passageway. We'll just have to see how this Damocles sword of a renewed military attack is hanging over the whole situation. I'm beginning to think there isn't going to be any more. I think maybe some not necessarily sensibility on the part of the president's been taking place, because I don't know that he can act sensibly. But maybe he's hearing from some people who are telling the truth, and he's paying attention to it. This is a no-win war. This will only get worse. And if you start mounting some kind of massive bombing attack against Iran, when you don't know where most of their missiles are hidden, they will take out whatever's left of any American base and whatever's left of Tel Aviv and Haifa and other parts of Israel. So there are many, many problems associated with this. Not the least, the mood in this country clearly has shifted dramatically against the war. Trump's approval rating the last time I saw was 33%. And 62% of all Americans are reported to disapprove of his job performance in general. And with the midterm elections just, 7 months away, there are a lot of commentaries and expectations that the Republicans are headed for a midterms crash. Maybe that is also consideration for what Trump's going to do, because naturally, the condition of the world is sliding into a depression, especially the economic portion of the world. And even in the best of all cases, is expected to take half a year or more to return to any kind of normalcy, even if the war would be stopped right now because of the damage that is already done. Now, unfortunately, this unprovoked war of aggression by the United States and Israel against Iran is not the only geopolitical insanity. Another one for sure, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately from Germany, which, despite the fact that they did not want to be a part of this war against Iran, the confrontation of Germany against Russia is so insane. that I think, I have to point this out. I mean, the so-called military strategy paper of the German defense minister Pistorius, while the full text, you can read it in English, the full text, um, it remains secret. There's only parts of it that's been released. The main argument is that Russia poses an acute threat to Germany. It said this: through its rearmament, it is preparing for a military confrontation with NATO, meaning Russia, of course, to infuse the use of military force as legitimate instruments of asserting its interests. And that Russia is creating the condition for a military attack on NATO, already conducting all these hybrid operations. Pistorius is only too happy to point out, now naturally, there's no proof of this whatsoever. But that line that they are already hybrid operations is being repeated ad nauseum. Pistorius also is saying that they want to develop the Bundeswehr into the strongest conventional army in Europe. And that involves increasing the number of troops to, I think, 460,000, which is against the 2+4 agreement, basically the legal basis for German unification. I don't have the exact number, but it's around 280,000 or something like that. But that also includes the reserves. This is the largest in the 2+4 agreement when both parts of Germany came back together again, that the army would ever be. And now, of course, Pistorius is doubling the number. Now, I think it may become an issue, but there are very clear refutations about that. One is the German ambassador in Moscow has been called to the foreign ministry in Moscow because this German ambassador to Moscow has been meeting with Chechen rebels, promising them support in their fight for independence, and that naturally is being regarded as a cross interference in the internal affairs of Russia. just like some foreign minister who's an ambassador to the United States meeting with the drug cartels in Mexico about how they can better support the cartel's efforts to get more drugs into America. That's the kind of sense that makes. So this is definitely increasing the tensions between Russia and Europe in general, but Germany in particular. Now, Sergei Karaganov made this massive attack on Europe in an interview with Karivsky, where he basically says the EU has gone mad and the EU has to be stopped. I can't contradict that assessment whatsoever, but a very interesting major policy speech given by Foreign Minister Lavrov back about a week ago. No, not even a week ago, just last weekend, in a meeting with leaders of the non-profit organizations. I took a look at the speech, and unfortunately, one has to come up to the conclusion that it's exactly what is the underlying reason for these present conflicts, where he basically says that the main threat to international peace and security is the fact that the collective West, which is not so collective anymore, but torn by disagreements, is intending to designate by any means and dominate by any means and continue to dominate and to preserve this Western hegemony for a long time, as long as possible. Then he attempted to demonize Russia, as they have been doing here for some time in preparing their war, and that recently even the Belgian General Staff publicly stated that they're getting ready for war with Russia. Belgium getting ready for war with Russia. In fact, the Belgian General Staff said, we're all ready for war with Russia. And that what's going on in Ukraine is just helping them to buy time. This is how I define insanity. Then he says of the openness with which Trump is now abandoning international law, he says this: on the one hand, this simplifies the situation. It becomes clear who is who. Many of our political analysts note that President Trump is open about his plans. He never misleads anybody. He may change his views frequently and quickly, depending on the situation, but he does not disguise these rather tough plans with rhetorical embellishments that would lead the discussion astray. So unfortunately, that's what is. And it's also naturally a topic of discussion that the U.S. standing in the world has clearly gone down. And the most recent blow was the war against Iran, which the United States cannot possibly win. So there is this interesting comparison made by Alfred McCoy in Consortium News, who interestingly compares the present decline of the United States with the decline of classical essence. And what he says is this: instead of another of the great victories, the empire won at its peak of power. However, such military misadventures only serve to accelerate the ongoing decline, erasing whatever aura of imperial majesty remains and revealing instead the moral rot deep inside the ruling elites. Then he compares the present Iran debacle to the defeat of the Athenians in Sicily in 413 BC, where in the protracted Peloponnesian Wars, they decided to attack Sparta's ally Syracuse in Sicily with a vast armada of 200 ships and some 12,000 soldiers, suffering a devastating defeat. So in any case, I think that's just atmospherics, but overall, it definitely interesting in the ongoing stage that's being set. What an incredible time to be alive. Now, that does not prevent the Western colonial powers from trying to knock off as many countries of the global South whose governments they don't like. The most recent example is a major attack to overthrow and destabilize the government of Mali, which naturally is in military alliance with Burkina Faso and Niger. So the defense minister, Camara, was killed, also his wife and their grandchildren. Camara died of his injuries after a shootout with militants following a suicide car bombing that targeted his residence, and that occurred in the context of a wave of coordinated terrorist attacks across the whole country. So the Russian Foreign Ministry had already stated earlier that they had preliminary data pointing to a possible involvement of Western security forces in training these attackers. And earlier, Lavrov had accused France of attempting to overthrow undesirable national governments in the Sahel zone. I mean, just business as usual. They won't do what we want them to do. They won't do what we threaten to do. And what's left for us but to go kill their leaders? So the EU, as I see it now, is certainly not a unity. Apart from the changes in Hungary, which is now more pro-European, and then on the other side, the case of Spain is a very laudable case moving in the opposite direction after the major visit of Prime Minister Sanchez to China. But there were huge demonstrations in Spain demanding the closing of the U.S. bases, which has been denied to be used for the attack against Iran. But now Spain has an interesting economic dynamic, and that is interestingly enough because the country in Europe, which has the highest life expectancy, is Spain. And again, I'm going to relate a story that occurred while I was in Valencia, attending the marriage of my youngest son to his beloved Andrea, who is a born and raised Spanish national. And the food that we ate, the food that was offered in restaurants, expensive restaurants down to cheap restaurants, was food that was harvested during the night to be served the following daylight hours in the way of fruits and vegetables and fish from the ocean, just caught. Fruits and vegetables just harvested. I wonder if that's got anything to do with how they have the highest life expectancy in Europe. Already in 2024, the average life expectancy of women was 86.6 years, compared to Austria that was 84.5. So obviously they've got a very good healthcare system, which is regarded as one of the best in all of Europe. They have a basic principle of public health service that applies to everybody. 99% of the population is insured, and the supply of experts and special doctors is extremely high. So that's another important thing to look at. So in Germany, on the other side, where the health system is collapsing, there's also the highest number of draft dodgers. Because Germany Pistorius wanting to double the size of the Bundeswehr. Germany's got a whole mess of draft dodgers right now. I mean, there's no draft, but there's discussion of reintroducing the draft. And the number of cases where young men have written in that they do not want to serve was already in the first quarter of this year, as high as the entire year of 2024, and the highest since the draft was abolished. So that's interesting. But otherwise, the situation in Germany, as I've said many times, it's collapsing, and the economy's in a free fall, and there is all the more enraging with the EU credit of 90 billion euros that they have given collectively to the Ukraine. And this is happening at a time when the German Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, has said that there is high evidence that the Kyiv Ukrainian government was complicit and knew about the attack on the Nord Stream. So it's kind of unbelievable, and I can only hope that sooner or later the population really rises up against it. And this, in the public domain, because of the correspondence of the Wall Street Journal, in a program on on public TV, coming out and pointing out the evidence points to the fact that the Kyiv government absolutely signed off on the sabotage of Nord Stream 2, which in the best of all of our analysis, we did that. Well, it's like Biden said we were going to do. So anyway, when you look at the headlines and the strategic outlines that are going on today and this week, it's only going to get more and more interesting. There's hardly any argument worth listening to the contrary, I would say. Now, on Monday morning, yesterday, 4 events of strategic consequence unfolded in 3 cities. And I think they should be read as probably in Washington, as I said, King Charles III shows up for a 4-day state visit. And Buckingham Palace released this, saying its historic connections and the modern bilateral relationship between Britain and the United States on the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution that severed those connections by force of arms in defense of the proposition that all men are created equal. In New York, at the same time, the 11th Review Conference of the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons opened yesterday at UN headquarters, where it's going to sit for nearly a month attempting to salvage a regime that the U.S. Israeli unprovoked bombardment of Iran, which happens to be a signatory to the NPT, and in good standing, which has at no point been credibly demonstrated to have been pursuing a nuclear weapon, has already been eviscerated. There's no way in the world that Iran could possibly be any threat to the United States. And more than a dozen different intelligence networks inside the United States, along with Tulsi Gabbard, back in 2023, March of 2023, made it very clear that not only does Iran not possess a nuclear weapon, they are on no pathway whatsoever to establish one. Now, in Islamabad, the Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi returns from Muscat to continue consultations with Pakistani leadership. He's already left, in fact. And do you see what happened with the three stooges from the United States that were supposed to attend this thing? Sometimes I'm at a complete loss, not just of words, but any cognizant thinking. When the Pakistanis have repeated the Iranians' words, "We will not meet with Witkoff and Kushner." We know that they are agents of Israel, that they're Zionists. We're not about to meet with them, and President Trump continues to send them. But there's three stooges. Unfortunately, the Vice President of the United States was in attendance. And in the last meeting last week, the big hubbub where Vice President Vance, whenever asked a simple yes or no question, had to leave the room and call his masters and find out how they felt on a particular subject before he went back in and answered it. So, in Islamabad, Araghchi had made Iran's position very clear. There will be no negotiations under the gun of a U.S. naval blockade. You're wasting your time showing up as long as the U.S. is blockading the Gulf. Although there's anywhere from 20 to 30 ships going through every day. They need a lot more than that. But there's up to 20 to 30 a day. And then, of course, now we're hosting the British King and Queen. Federal investigators are processing the apprehension of Cole Thomas Allen, this 31-year-old Caltech-trained mechanical engineer who broke his way. He goes through the metal detector, and as Johnson is pointing out, the metal detector was at the wrong end of the hallway. Right there at the door. Goes barging through a metal detector, his gun setting off the alarm, attempting to shoot his way into the ballroom where the President of the United States and members of the cabinet were dining. What a strange convergence. Appearing on the eve of the British King's lecture to the U.S. Congress. I suppose it may be going on now, for all I know. I suppose it will be live on TV, where the British King will be addressing our Congress, and those butt kissers will be standing up and giving him a standing ovation over and over again. The man that represents the country who has killed more people on the face of this planet in the last 300 years than Stalin did or Mao did. So just what this comedy of errors, this farcical celebration, including the king of the country that we separated ourselves with patriots' blood. Get the hell out of here. So Britain is in Washington celebrating this special relationship, this Anglo-American, which has consisted of attempts to turn the United States constantly against its revolutionary anti-imperial founding. And most recently, this has been included dragging the United States into a war of aggression against Iran, a war whose combined efforts so far, and we're starting the 9th week, over 1 billion barrels of lost oil production, the Pentagon's expenditure of more than 1,000 Tomahawks, up to 2,000 air defense interceptors, which according to the most conservative estimates, liberal estimates, will take 6 to 7 years to replace. And then extensive Iranian damage to the U.S. military bases that are not getting reported adequately throughout the Persian Gulf, the spread of fertilizer and food crises already in conflict-stricken areas of Africa and Asia, and the de facto collapse of the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. You just got to love this stuff. And now, the state banquet of the king, the 4-day visit, will deliver a joint meeting of the U.S. Congress. He is the second British monarch to address Congress following his mother Elizabeth back in 1991. And the address is intended to reaffirm the special relationship between Britain and the United States. And the congressional leaders' invitation acknowledged, with no apparent embarrassment, that the American experiment endures in no small part because of the British tradition from which it sprang. That's a news release. I can hardly get that out of my mouth without vomiting. With no apparent embarrassment, that the American experiment endures in no small part because of the British tradition from which it sprang. We sprang from the British tradition of a monarchy. So not just the monarchy, the empire, the British Empire, that included the slave trade and partitioning of Africa, the conquest, dismemberment, starvation of Ireland, the Opium Wars against China, the colonization and partition of India, including the Bengal famines, the Sykes-Picot dismemberment of Southwest Asia, and most relevantly in this week, the post-Cold War project of organizing the Anglosphere for permanent confrontation with Russia, China, and Iran. So this is the tradition that Speaker Johnson, choice of the phrase, he said, from which the American experiment sprang. Slave trade, starvation. As John Adams, one of my favorite founders of this country, wrote to Abigail Adams on July 3rd, 1776, the day before the Declaration was signed, I am well aware of the toil and the blood and the treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. Well, that gloom continues because it's going to be very gloomy with King Charles' visit. What light may yet break through depends on whether members of the U.S. Congress and the citizens who voted to put him there remember what it is we are commemorating in this 250th anniversary the break from colonialization, the revolutionary dynamic that spilled the blood of so many American patriots to break free from a monarchy where you were subjects instead of citizens. Are you a subject in this country, or are you a citizen? Well, what a time to be alive, don't you think? What an interesting time, as the Chinese say. May you be born or live whatever in interesting times. Hardly a day goes by that some other curveball doesn't go flying across the plate to see if you can hit it or not. So many people are refusing to go out on the field anymore. 45 years ago, on March 30th, 1981, John Hinckley Jr. shot President Ronald Reagan as he emerged from the same building the Trump administration is preparing to host King Charles, in the same city beginning now this week. All right, we're going to go to Lowell here. Lowell is waiting anxiously to share the best that he has with you. I'm going to stop the recording so that I can save it. I hope we were broadcasting today. And I'm going to end the stream. For those that you were participating, I'll be back tomorrow with a health show. Lots of good stuff. I think every new patient position this week is full because we're still doing the half-off special. And my goodness, I've been taking care of people I haven't seen nearly 20 years and still using their old films and getting great corrections on these people. So I'm going to end the stream. For the streamers, thank you for being there. Like and subscribe if you can.